listener production.
Hello, happy Friday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. There's a theory going around right now based off a recent study that predicts more than 1.5 million more crimes will be committed in Australia by the end of the century, and the cause will be climate change.
It would be things like person-to-person conflict, in the moment kinds of things. So think road rage, interpersonal altercations, like if someone bumps you, how do you respond to that? And even things like domestic violence are also more likely to increase.
Our deep dive into the link between rising temperatures and criminality is coming up in the second half of this episode. But first, it is time for all the biggest stories of the day with Chris Spyrou. It's Friday, January 17th.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody, and happy Friday. Israel is stalling on a ceasefire deal with Hamas, saying that the group has backed away from key parts of the agreement. Benjamin Netanyahu's government was due to have voted on the deal, but that's been delayed, sparking fears the fighting won't stop on Sunday as initially agreed. A spokesperson for Hamas has disputed the claim, saying they have not reneged on the deal. Bassem Naim, the head of Hamas's political and international relations, was also asked about the group's future in Gaza, saying they are ready to hold an election and let the people decide on leadership.
Yeah, despite the pause in progress on this deal, US officials do remain confident the ceasefire and hostage swap can start this weekend. White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby confirming they are working through some last-minute issues, but they hope to have them resolved in time. Now, the news of a ceasefire and hostage return sparked scenes of celebration in the Middle East and was welcomed by leaders around the world. Last night, we heard from the Treasurer Jim Chalmers. He told the ABC that now is the time for peace.
Too much blood has been shed already and too many innocent lives have already been lost. Now we need to see all parties on all sides stick to the terms of the agreement, because we want to make sure that this peace is lasting rather than fleeting.
Yeah, so the US giving that confirmation, Chris, probably allayed some pretty well-founded fears that is this going to fall over at the last minute. It does still remain unclear, though, when the Israeli cabinet vote could take place. And several Israeli news organisations are reporting that there are internal divisions within the Netanyahu government that could be a factor behind the delay. We did speak in the headlines yesterday about a senior minister wanting to quit over a ceasefire deal and how that could threaten Netanyahu's hold on power. So there are lots of moving parts to this. And unfortunately, it is extremely political rather than taking into account the huge loss of life and the lives of the hostages still in Gaza. Of course, we did look into this yesterday. Ben-Sion Siebert did an interview deep diving the deal, what it means and what could be in the future. Worth a listen if you want to get up to date on that.
Staying overseas, and TikTok fans in the US are waiting with bated breath to see if Donald Trump will step in and save the app. A top advisor, Sash, is saying he will. Mike Waltz, who is a Florida Republican and the president-elect's incoming national security advisor, has told Fox News they will intervene.
He's a deal maker. I don't want to get ahead of our executive orders, but we're going to create the space to put that deal in place.
I love how they speak with such conviction. Look, the Supreme Court is considering whether to uphold the law that bans the platform in the US unless it is sold by its Chinese owner ByteDance by the 19th of January, Sash.
But it is worth noting it's not clear if an executive order would actually have the power to circumvent the law in this case because it was voted on by Congress. 170 million Americans have an account on TikTok. I am a very active TikTok user, Chris, and I have seen over the last couple of weeks, but especially in the last couple of days, many creators posting goodbye messages and telling their followers what other platforms they can be found on. Now, I've been waiting for this to be reversed or for something to change. It hasn't happened. So last night I actually started a new note in my notes app with all the names of all the American creators that I like, because I'm going to be really sad. I'm going to miss them.
Yeah.
They become part of your day. It's so freaking sad to admit, but they do.
Yeah, and it's funny because this term TikTok refugee has sprung up and that's trending at the moment because a lot of these creators are moving to another Chinese app called Red Note, which is something that Helen Smith deep dived on Wednesday. We'll pop the link in the show notes if you want to go listen to that episode. And it's just so interesting. A lot of people in the US, the commentary is that we don't care that our data might be mined or sold or that the Chinese government's spying on us. We just want to laugh and have a good time. So we'll see what happens.
I think as well, though, it's been a huge money. It's a job for so many people now. And you see so many creators saying, I quit my job. I was able to quit my job in corporate marketing or in real estate or whatever to do this full time. And they're terrified that they're going to lose that income stream. So for them, it's almost like losing a job that they don't want to lose. I do want to say something that the New York Times is reporting just very quickly, which could also signal what might happen to TikTok in America. Trump has actually invited the chief executive of the app, Xiaozi Chu, to attend his inauguration on Monday, Tuesday morning our time, and he will be sitting in a position of honour on the days. Now, Trump would love to have this win because he'd be seen to be rescuing the app. 170 million Americans, that's a lot of people. And he also has a lot of people who support him on the app, and there are plenty of influencers who are very pro-Trump and who are spreading his message. So I think for him, he views it as a smart political decision.
Back home now, day 5 of the Oz Open has officially wrapped, but not without some spice and drama. In the early hours of this morning, world number 5 Daniil Medvedev crashed out in a shock loss to 19-year-old American Lerner Tien, opting to skip the post-match press conference, which is, a bit of a behavioural change to his last match where he smashed a GoPro on court, Sash. So we'll take a bit of silence as opposed to some violence. The thrilling 5-set contest between the Russian and the world's 121st player finished just before 3 a.m, Tien making this confession after the almost 5-hour match.
Honestly, in the 4th set, I just had to pee so bad.
Well, that makes 2 of us, Leonard.
So I was just trying to finish it up fairly quick.
Oh, I love it. And I know that's something you can relate to, given this is your 3rd trimester of pregnancy, Sasha Barbagat.
Yes, always needing the loo. Meantime, Alex de Minaur kept the Aussie flag flying with a comfortable win over American Tristan Boyer. But Tristan's schoolmate, fellow Aussie, was knocked out by defending champ Yannick Sinner. And there were high hopes for Aussie comeback queen Destiny Iava, but she lost to America's Danielle Collins. Now, Collins has been dubbed the AO's new villain after she taunted the home crowd, blowing kisses and slapping her bum after they spent the whole match booing her.
I was thinking during the match, I was like, if I'm out here, I might as well just take that big fat paycheck. And we love a good 5-star vacation. So part of that check is going to go towards that. So thank you guys. Thanks for coming out here and supporting us tonight. Thanks, everyone. Thank you guys. Love ya.
Yeah, definitely very popular with the crowd there, Ms. Collins.
Oh, gosh, a home crowd, especially at the AO, is a very fascinating one to watch. And that's something that we saw yesterday with the Special Ks. Nick Kyrgios and Thanasi Kokkinakis, they took to the court in the doubles. The crowd were definitely in their favour. They were versing fellow Aussies James Duckworth and Alexander Vukic. Unfortunately, the Special Ks had to bow out and call the game early, too injured to go on. But I mean, Sash, the 1 hour or so that I watched was so entertaining and riveting. And like I said, the crowd was just absolutely wild. And hey, in action today, we have defending champ Aryna Sabalenka, Naomi Osaka, Novak Djokovic, and Aussie Alexander Vukic for those who are watching.
And here's one to discuss at the family barbecue this weekend. A new study has found parents favour their older children and girls, and that is having a big impact on all of their kids. So researchers from universities in the US and Canada have collected data from a bunch of sources spanning almost 20,000 participants around the world. And what they've discovered is that there's preferential treatment for daughters, for older children, and kids who are more conscientious or agreeable. So if you're the middle or younger sibling or a boy, the study suggests that may have had negative consequences for your development as a kid.
Yep.
Chris, I'm an only child, so I can't relate. I was number 1 in all aspects. But can you relate to this study?
Yeah, look, I am the youngest of 2. I am also a boy. Look, I'll say this. We have balance in my home. I am definitely mum's favourite. I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of dad, but all evidence would lead to suggest that I am not in fact dad's favourite. And that point you raise about agreeability. Now, Sash, we've worked together for about 2 and a bit years now. Agreeability, would you say that's a characteristic of mine that rises to the top? Your silence speaks volume. Your silence speaks volumes. Look, I do want to point out too, there were some limitations with this study. The team couldn't take into account the role of perceived fairness around differences in parenting or the complex nature of family relationships. So maybe pump your brakes before having a go at mum and dad when you see them next. I mean, that's advice I'm giving. That's also not advice I'm taking.
Oh, good luck with that one. Thank you so much, Chris. Next up, we are getting into your deep dive that's looking at whether there's a link between climate change and criminality.
When you think of climate change, where does your mind go? You might think of hotter days, more natural disasters, melting ice, dead animals, all environmental things, right? But what if I told you a global rise in our temperatures has the power to shape individual behaviour, like actually modify the way our brains work? One Australian study says that's a real possibility that we need to start bracing for, predicting over 1.5 million more crimes will be committed by the end of the century, all thanks to climate change. So what is it about the heat that could turn us into criminals? Associate Professor Lindsie Arthur from the University of Melbourne School of Psychological Science is here to explain. Lindsie, is there actual proof that hot weather leads to more crimes?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I think that the way that we need to think about it is that context is really important. So there's a theory called the heat hypothesis, which argues that when people experience hotter conditions, whether that's just ambient temperature or if they're, for example, sitting on a hot seat or something like that, then they feel more agitated and therefore that leads to, I guess, like negative emotions and may lead to more aggression. This idea came out of some research that sort of originated in the 70s, where they would put people in different physical contexts and would see if when they were hot compared to neutral or cold, do they behave more aggressively? And there is some evidence for that. There's also been some real world studies. So there's a really famous one where it's an observational study where they were looking at whether or not people, when they were playing baseball, if the temperature was hotter, were they more aggressive? And the research suggests yes. And then the final sort of piece of evidence that would lead us to suggest that heat is associated with more violence or more aggression. We have studies where they look at crime statistics in different contexts and different temperatures. And there's some evidence that at higher temperatures, there are more crimes, essentially.
In terms of those studies relating to crime, what are the type of crime areas or crimes that we will see spiking in, hotter temperatures?
I guess the heat hypothesis would argue that it would be things like person-to-person conflict, in the moment kinds of things. So think road rage, interpersonal altercations, like if someone bumps you, how do you respond to that? And even things like domestic violence are also more likely to increase or be high rather on hot days. But there's also evidence that the hotter months, so when we're in summer, that there's an increase in things like property crime. But that is less to do with the psychological mechanism of being hot, and it's more opportunistic. So, for example, houses are just more likely to be empty during the summer months. We're more likely to be out and about. And as a result, houses are more likely to be empty and therefore prime to be the victims, I guess, of property crime.
Yeah, and I mean, property crime was something that was looked at in this Australian study that ultimately estimated we will be seeing 1.64 million more crimes by the end of the century. So yearly, that translates to 72,000 more crimes a year. How credible do you think those numbers are? I know they are estimates, but how credible do you think they are?
I do think that we need to be wary of modelling studies. I think that they're exceptionally useful. So a modelling study is where they take existing data and they look at whether or not that can predict things in the future. But they're not very good at adapting to changes that we experience across time. So for example, if we get better at managing heat or if we are able to reduce aggression and violence in general, then those statistics would come down.
In terms of managing heat, there are these large ambitious targets that we do have in the global community in terms of reducing global warming, and there's policies that are working to that effect. What can an individual person do to better curb their behaviours during heat spikes?
That's a really interesting question. We often over-rely on the idea that individuals are responsible for what we should be doing. And I think that particularly in the case of heat, this is a global problem. And saying that individuals should be doing more is sort of scapegoating the people where we can really see a difference. So I think that if we're seeing more violence, then we should be going to the root cause and trying to reduce the violence rather than trying to say that individuals should do something different. And I think that this is the point that I was trying to make earlier, that context is really important. So, for example, some of the research would suggest, actually including that study that you mentioned earlier, would suggest that in low socioeconomic environments, that heat has an even more amplified effect on increasing violence. But I think that that comes down to the context. So if people are in an environment where this increased heat is having some kind of adverse effect on the individual or making it hard for them to access resources like food or water, or maybe they've been working outside in a factory all day. Those are contextual things that we could be trying to address rather than saying that the individual should be doing something different.
In terms of those root causes, what are some other contextual factors that you would want people to be aware of rather than, blaming the heat on poor behaviour?
What's really clear from the literature is that heat is a threat multiplier. So heat itself is unlikely to lead to large increases in violence in particular. But when we have other conditions, so for example, if we have resource scarcity, so people can't access food or water, or maybe their employment or income is more likely to be unstable in different heat conditions, then that's when we're going to start to see problems. Like, for example, people who are living in regional communities where their livelihoods depend on what temperatures there are. So, for example, people who work in crops or livestock, if heat is affecting their income and then that is affecting their stress levels, then we might see higher rates of violence and aggression.
Yeah, so to be clear, this is a situation of correlation as opposed to a situation of causation. So I can't walk outside today, and it is a really hot day in Sydney. I can't walk outside today and blame the weather for my bad behaviour.
I don't think so, no.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's relatable, right? Everyone's had that experience. You're feeling really hot and agitated because someone cut them off but no, unfortunately, I think that would not be, wouldn't go down so well.
Okay, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. It won't hold up in a court of law. Hey, I do want to ask you though, aside from the victims of crime, this could impact our justice system, emergency services and economy. Do you think the government is aware of these forecasts, and do you think they're prepared enough for this to happen if, for example, 72,000 more crimes do eventuate because of climate change?
I think that we need more interdisciplinary research to really understand the complexities of this problem, where we're looking at the ways that different things interact. So looking at, say housing and heat and employment and how those things are interacting. And that's currently what's lacking.
If you had a magic wand, which, we all wish we did, and you could wave it tomorrow, what's the immediate resolution? Is it more police boots on the ground? Is it cooler buildings? Is it something else?
For me, I think education is huge. There's a really clear relationship between education levels and violent behaviour. There's a few different mechanisms that is likely to be happening through. So, for example, we know that spending more time in education improves things like your patience or your ability to regulate your behaviour, but also just more time in school means less time out on the street, potentially creating havoc. I don't think policing is the solution, but that's not my area. So perhaps it's part of the solution. But yeah, I think for me, like going to the root causes of the problem is going to be much more effective and also much more challenging. I can acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I want to return for my last question. I want to return to something you mentioned earlier, just the idea that heat frustrates us. And that's a very low level thing. What are some coping mechanisms or strategies that everyday Australians can adopt just to get a little less frustrated the hotter it gets?
I'm a big fan of mindfulness. I just think it's so effective, just taking a breath, taking a step back. But I think that if the heat is what's causing you to be agitated, then there are probably other things in your life that could be causing you to have a higher state of existing arousal. And I'm a root causes kind of person. So yeah, if the heat is the final straw, I don't know, maybe have an ice bowl.
Perfect. Associate Professor Lindsie Arthur from the University of Melbourne School of Psychological Science speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So we're sharing our social posts. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another rep at 3 p.m. this afternoon, and that's not all. Antoinette Lattouf joined you with a weekend briefing tomorrow. This weekend, she steps behind the glitz and glamour of Dubai Bling with presenter Chris Fade.
3 weeks after it came out, I went to LA with my wife. That's where Brianna's from, and I'm walking down the street of Sunset, and I'm just getting stopped. Yo, Chris, oh my gosh, Dubai Bling. And I'm like, whoa, this show's massive.
Massive, yeah.
You know, and then I went to Qatar, the same thing happened. I went to London, was like ridiculous. I mean, there was a point in London where I was sitting down at a cafe with my family and we had to leave because it just started, like, a lot of people started coming through.
And if celebrity highs and lows are your thing and that's not enough for your weekend, our mates over at Fifi, Fev and Nick, the podcast, have an episode out now with some insider knowledge and a hint of speculation on who will be trapped in the jungle for the upcoming season of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Australia. If you're a fan of Dave Hughes, Olympian Emma McKeon and comedian from across the Dutch, Melanie Bracewell, you'll want to listen to this full episode out now on the Listener app or wherever you get your podcasts. The briefing is produced by Sasha Barber-Gatt, Bensian Siebert, Helen Smith, and me, Chris Spyrou. Audio production by Chris Marsh and Darcy Thompson, and the briefing's executive producer is Jessica Wukyanov. Thanks as always for listening. Catch you next time.